"You gave me steel, Blacksmith? Get ready, I claim you now," said the Apache fugitive woman. The winds of Oasis carried the harsh scent of dust and rust as Ayana moved swiftly through the barren land. Her boots kicked up sand with every step, but she didn't care. She was used to the desert, used to running, and used to the endless chase. The lawmen and bounty hunters who pursued her had never been able to catch her, and they never would. Not until she had finished what she came here to do. Ayana was no ordinary fugitive. She was a woman born of the Earth's oldest traditions, raised in the Apache ways, a warrior, a survivor. Her dark eyes held the weight of the past, and her soul carried the fire of revenge. Her father, a man of honor, had been betrayed by the men who now ruled this dusty town of Barlow's Ridge. They controlled the resources, the water, and the power, and they had crushed Ayana's family beneath their boots. They took everything from her. Now, it was time for payback. For months she had wandered through the wasteland, a shadow of her former self, yet her mind had never wavered from the path of vengeance. There was only one way she could do this. She needed a weapon, one unlike any other, one forged with skill, precision, and power. And she had heard whispers of a blacksmith, a man who could craft weapons from the finest steel, weapons that could change the course of a battle. That's why she had come to this forgotten corner of the universe. She had come to the blacksmith's forge. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an orange glow over the desert, Ayana spotted the blacksmith's workshop. It was a small, humble building tucked away behind a rocky outcrop, its chimney puffing out a small trail of smoke. The forge was still burning, the fire crackling with life. Ayana approached with caution, her hand resting on the grip of her blaster. She had learned the hard way that trust was a rare commodity out here. Everyone had a price, and she didn't know if this man would be willing to help her. But she had no choice. She had to take the risk. She stepped inside, the heavy door creaking as it opened. The blacksmith, a tall man with a rugged face, looked up from the anvil. He was covered in soot, his hands worn from years of hammering metal. His eyes were cold at first, studying her, but there was something else, something that suggested curiosity. "You've come," he said, his voice low and steady. "I've heard the stories about you." She simply stood there, her gaze locked on the man before her. The blacksmith didn't seem intimidated by her presence, even though she knew she looked like a walking storm. Her long black hair was tangled, and her clothes were stained with the marks of long travels. She was a woman on the edge, ready to strike. "You're not afraid of me?" she finally asked, her voice sharp. The blacksmith chuckled, the sound rough, like gravel being ground underfoot. "I'm not afraid of many things," he said. "What's your name, stranger?"
"Ayana," she replied.
"I'm here for a weapon." The blacksmith raised an eyebrow. "A weapon?" he repeated. "For what purpose?" Ayana's eyes narrowed. "To kill the men who killed my father." The air in the workshop grew thick with tension. The blacksmith studied her, his gaze unflinching. He knew this woman wasn't like the others who came to him with requests for simple tools. There was something in her presence that demanded respect, a power that was undeniable. "You want a weapon?" he said slowly, "but not just any weapon. You want something forged in fire, something that will carry your vengeance to the very heart of your enemies. I need a blade, a weapon that can kill them all." The blacksmith didn't speak for a moment. Instead, he turned to the forge and began to work, his hammer falling rhythmically against the steel. The sound of the strike echoed through the workshop, like the heartbeat of the world itself. Ayana stood there, watching him, waiting. She wasn't in a hurry. Time didn't matter to her anymore. She had already lost everything that once mattered. After a few minutes, the blacksmith turned to her, holding a glowing piece of metal in his tongs. "Steel," he said. "This is the base, but you will need something more. This will be the foundation, but it's your will that will make the blade sharp, your anger that will make it deadly." Ayana stepped closer, watching as the blacksmith placed the glowing metal onto the anvil. He raised his hammer high, then brought it down with a force that made the whole workshop shake. Sparks flew into the air, lighting the space with brief flashes of light. With every strike, the metal began to take shape. It was no longer just a piece of steel. It was becoming something more, something that would carry her revenge. "Forged in fire," the blacksmith said, his voice steady. "But you'll need to wield it not just with strength, but with purpose." Ayana's gaze never wavered from the work in front of her. The blacksmith was right. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice, her justice. And once the blade was finished, she would be ready. As the last of the metal took form, The blacksmith set the hammer down. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his eyes meeting Ayana's. "It's ready," he said, "but there's a cost." Ayana's eyes hardened. "What kind of cost?" The blacksmith smiled grimly. "Everything has a cost. You can't escape it no matter how hard you try. I'll pay it." He handed her the blade, its edge gleaming in the dim light of the workshop. It was long, sleek, and deadly, just as she had envisioned. She held it in her hand, feeling the weight of it, the power it carried. It was more than just a weapon. It was a promise. Ayana looked at the blacksmith. "You gave me steel, blacksmith," she said quietly, "but it's not just steel that will get me through this." The blacksmith watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "You claim it now," he said, as if he had known this moment would come all along. She turned to leave, the blade now a part of her, a part of the storm she would bring to Barlow's Ridge. The blacksmith didn't stop her, but his eyes followed her as she walked out into the night, ready to face whatever came next. Ayana stood under the twin moons of Oasis, the cool desert air brushing her skin as she adjusted the blade at her side. The weapon that the blacksmith had forged was heavier than she expected, but it felt right. It was perfect. She could feel its power in the weight of her hand, the deadly edge that now belonged to her. It was a tool for vengeance, but it was also something more, something that connected her to a past that she would never forget. The path ahead was uncertain, but Ayana knew one thing for sure. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not after everything she had lost. She had told the blacksmith she would pay any price, but the cost of the blade was more than just the exchange of money. It was the risk of everything she had left. Ayana didn't know what the future held, but she did know that the men who had wronged her family would never rest easy again. Not while she was breathing. The night had settled in around the workshop, and the blacksmith had returned to his work. The heat of the forge had died down, leaving only the quiet crackle of embers. She turned to him one last time before stepping out into the night. "I'll be back when this is done," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a fire in her words. The blacksmith didn't say anything at first. He simply nodded, as if he knew she would return, perhaps sooner than either of them expected. Ayana traveled through the desert with her heart full of resolve. The blade by her side was a constant reminder of what she had come to do. She knew it wouldn't be easy. It never was. The men she was after weren't just corrupt officials. They were powerful, well-armed, and well-connected. The town of Barlow's Ridge, where they held their control, was surrounded by armed men, bounty hunters, and mercenaries. But Ayana didn't fear them. She had survived far worse. She had survived the death of her father, the destruction of her family, and the years of running. She had lived in the shadows long enough. Now she was going to make the light shine on those who had done her wrong. As the sun began to rise, casting its golden light over the barren land, Ayana could see the first signs of Barlow's Ridge in the distance. The outline of buildings appeared like shadows against the brightening sky, and in the air she could almost taste the dust of the town. It was a place where greed and corruption ruled, where the powerful crushed the weak under their boots. Ayana's footsteps grew steadier as she approached. She had planned for this moment for months, maybe even years. She knew where to strike, who to strike, and how to take them all down. When Ayana arrived at the edge of the town, she found a small alleyway to slip into. The quiet was deceptive. Behind the walls of the saloons and the gambling halls, people were always watching. They were always waiting for something to happen. Ayana stayed in the shadows, moving with purpose. Her heart beat with the rhythm of her steps, steady, unwavering. She had no fear. The blade she carried was an extension of herself, and she would use it to tear down the walls of this corrupt town. But first, she needed information. She entered a small cantina at the edge of the town, hoping to find someone who could point her in the right direction. The place was dimly lit, the air thick with smoke and the smell of cheap liquor. A few men sat at the bar, their eyes barely lifting as she walked past. She ignored them, heading straight for a table in the corner where a man sat alone. He was a rough-looking man, dressed in worn-out clothes, his face scarred by time and battles. He looked up as Ayana approached, his gaze flickering with interest. Ayana sat down across from him, her eyes cold, her voice calm. "I need information about the men running this town," she said, her tone sharp. The man studied her for a moment, his eyes scanning her face. He wasn't intimidated, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Ayana could tell he knew exactly who she was. Her reputation had spread across the desert. She wasn't just a fugitive anymore. She was a name to be feared. "They're bad men," the man said slowly, his voice low. "You're not the first to come looking for revenge. But they got a lot of people in their pockets. You can't just walk in and take them down." Ayana leaned in closer, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not just walking in. I'm coming to finish what they started. The man hesitated, then nodded. You're right. But you'll need help. There's a guard posted at the front gate, and the leader, Voss, he's a former soldier, good with a rifle. His men are loyal. And there's more. Much more. They'll be expecting you. Ayana listened carefully, her mind already racing through the plans. She had thought about this moment for so long, and now it was finally here. She couldn't afford to make any mistakes. She couldn't afford to fail. Where can I find them? Ayana asked. The man gave her a quick glance, then leaned back. You're going to need to sneak in and take them by surprise. If you can get close to Voss, you might stand a chance, but it won't be easy. Ayana didn't flinch. It never is. That night, Ayana made her way to the center of Barlow's Ridge. The town was quieter now, but she knew the people here were always watching. The men in charge kept things under control with fear, and that fear was something she would use against them. She reached the gates, where a small group of guards stood watch. Ayana moved swiftly, like a shadow in the night. She knew what she had to do. She knew she had to make her move, and she couldn't waste any more time. As she approached, she drew the blade from its sheath. It gleamed under the moonlight, a silent promise of what was to come. Ayana's steps were soft but purposeful, and within moments she had taken out the guards silently. They never had a chance. With the gates open, Ayana slipped inside. She was getting closer. Closer to the heart of the corruption, closer to the men who had taken everything from her. And when she finally found them, when she came face to face with the leader of this place, she would make sure they knew who she was, and that they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Ayana was coming for them all. No one would be spared. Not when the storm was this close. The night had settled over Barlow's Ridge, but Ayana could feel the tension in the air. The shadows around her seemed to whisper of danger, of betrayal, of the price that came with vengeance. She moved like a ghost, silent and determined, her every step bringing her closer to the men who had destroyed her family. The blade at her side was an extension of her will, and tonight it would be used to sever the ties of corruption that had strangled this town. Ayana had already taken out the guards at the gate, but she knew this was just the beginning. The men she was after didn't hide behind walls or lock doors. They were out there, in plain sight, holding power over the lives of everyone in the town. The leader, Carter Voss, was the man who had betrayed her father and set everything in motion. It was Voss who had destroyed her family, and it was Voss who would pay the price. She crouched low in the shadows, her senses alert. There was no sound except for the distant rustling of the desert wind and the soft creak of wooden buildings. The streets of Barlow's Ridge were empty now, but that wouldn't last. The men who worked for Voss would soon realize something was wrong. Ayana's eyes narrowed as she saw movement in the distance. 2 men, walking side by side, talking in low voices. She didn't need to hear the words. She could tell from their body language that they were important. The way they carried themselves, the way they walked with purpose. These were the kinds of men she needed to deal with. She waited for the right moment, her hand tightening around the hilt of the blade. The moonlight reflected off its edge, and for a brief second she felt a surge of power. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. Ayana moved quickly, her boots barely making a sound as she approached the 2 men. With a fluid motion, she drew the blade and slashed through the air. The first man never had a chance to react. His throat was cut in a single precise strike. The second man's eyes widened in shock, but Ayana was already on him, the blade cutting through the air with deadly speed. He tried to draw his weapon, but it was too late. Ayana's strike was faster, and he fell to the ground with a heavy thud. The 2 men were dead before they could even scream. Ayana stood over their bodies for a moment, her chest heaving with the adrenaline of the kill. But she didn't let herself pause for long. She couldn't afford to. The rest of Voss's men would be looking for her by now, and she needed to keep moving. There was still a lot of work to be done. She moved deeper into the town, her eyes scanning the shadows, her ears listening for any signs of trouble. The blade felt heavier now, but she welcomed the weight of it. Every step brought her closer to Voss. Every life she took was one less obstacle in her path. Ayana finally reached the center of town. There, in the heart of the lawless place, stood the saloon. It was where the most powerful men in the town gathered, where they held meetings and made their plans. It was where Voss would be. The doors to the saloon were wide open, and the sounds of laughter and shouting spilled out into the street. Inside, she knew, was a room full of enemies, men who would fight to the death to protect their leader. But Ayana had never been afraid of dying. She had learned that death was a part of life, a part of the fight. And she would fight until the last breath left her body, if it came to that. She didn't hesitate. Ayanna pushed the door open, stepping into the saloon. The noise stopped instantly as everyone turned to look at her. The men inside were all armed, and their hands immediately went for their weapons. But they didn't know who they were dealing with. Ayanna was faster. She moved like a blur, cutting through the room with precision. The first man lunged at her with a knife, but she sidestepped and brought her blade down in a sharp arc, disarming him in a single move. The second man fired his gun, but Ayanna was already on him, twisting the weapon from his hand and knocking him out cold. The fight escalated quickly, but Ayanna was in control. She danced around the men, her movements fluid and deadly. She didn't waste a single motion. Every strike, every cut was calculated. The saloon floor was soon littered with bodies, the sound of metal meeting flesh echoing through the room. Ayanna's heart raced with the thrill of the fight, but she didn't let it distract her. She had one goal, to get to Voss, and nothing was going to stop her. At last, she saw him, Carter Voss. He was sitting at a table near the back of the room, his back to her, surrounded by his closest men. He had no idea she was there. Ayanna took a deep breath and moved toward him. Her boots were silent on the wooden floor, and her eyes were locked on her target. The men around him didn't see her coming, but Voss did. He turned just as she reached his table, his eyes narrowing in recognition. "So, the fugitive finally comes for me," he sneered, rising from his chair. "I was wondering when you'd show up, Apache." Ayanna didn't respond. She didn't need to. The blade in her hand said everything. Voss drew his weapon, a large revolver, but Ayanna was faster. She lunged at him, the blade flashing through the air. Voss fired his gun, but the bullet missed. Ayanna was already on him, her blade at his throat. He backed away, fear flickering in his eyes for the first time. "You think you can kill me?" he growled. Ayanna's gaze was cold, her voice low and steady. "You killed my father. You destroyed everything I had. And now I'm going to take everything from you." With one swift motion, she ended it. The blade pierced through his throat, and he collapsed to the floor, gasping for air. The saloon was silent. The men who had followed Voss were dead, and now the leader lay at her feet. Ayanna stood over him, her chest heaving as she caught her breath.
The storm was over. The battle had been won.
She took a moment to look around the room, at the bodies scattered across the floor. This was the cost of vengeance, the price of justice. But it was worth it. Ayanna turned and walked out of the saloon, the blade still in her hand. The streets of Barlow's Ridge were quiet now, the echoes of violence fading into the night. She had claimed her revenge, and now, for the first time in years, she was free. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over Barlow's Ridge. The town was quiet now, the last echoes of battle fading into the night. The dust had settled, and the once chaotic streets were now eerily still. Ayanna stood alone, her chest heaving from the fight. Her boots crunched on the dirt as she walked through the empty streets, her blade still at her side. The weight of it felt different now, not as heavy, but as if it were a part of her, a promise kept. She had done it. She had avenged her father's death, taken down the men who had betrayed her family, and crushed the corrupt empire that had ruled this lawless town. But as she walked through the streets of Barlow's Ridge, there was no joy in her victory, no sense of satisfaction, just a quiet emptiness. For years she had lived with the burning need for revenge. It had consumed her, driven her every action, every step, but now that it was over, Ayanna felt lost. She had been so focused on one goal for so long that she didn't know what came next. She had no home, no family. And though she had taken down the men who wronged her, there was still a part of her that felt hollow. The vengeance she had sought so desperately hadn't filled the emptiness inside her. It had only deepened it. Ayanna paused near the saloon, the scene of the final fight. The bloodstains were already beginning to dry, the once proud building now standing as a grim reminder of the battle that had taken place within its walls. She reached up and wiped the sweat from her brow, her mind racing with the weight of the choices she had made. Was this all she had? Was this what her life had become? One fight after another, chasing a never-ending cycle of vengeance? She didn't know. But one thing was clear. She couldn't stay in Barlow's Ridge. There was nothing left for her here. The people she had come to kill were dead, and the town was now a graveyard of broken lives. It was time to leave. The next morning, Ayanna walked to the outskirts of the town, her pack slung over her shoulder. She had taken what she needed, A few supplies, enough to keep her going for a while. She didn't look back as she left Barlow's Ridge behind. The sun was rising, casting a new light over the land, and for the first time in a long while, Ayanna felt the weight of her past begin to lift. The further she walked from the town, the lighter she felt. The desert stretched out before her, vast and unforgiving. It was a place she knew well. She'd spent so many years running through it, hiding from the past, chasing vengeance. Now she was walking away from it all. She didn't know where she was going. But for the first time in years, that uncertainty didn't scare her. Her footsteps were steady, her mind clear. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she was ready to face it. As the day wore on, Ayanna found herself at the foot of a rocky cliff, the hot sun beating down on her back. She sat down, wiping the sweat from her brow. The blade she had carried with her all this time was still strapped to her side, but now it felt more like a burden than a tool of vengeance. She hadn't used it in hours, and for the first time she realized she didn't need it. Ayanna had spent so many years clinging to the past, holding on to her anger. But now, as she sat beneath the open sky, she realized that holding on to that anger wasn't going to get her anywhere. It hadn't brought her peace. It hadn't brought her anything but pain. She could feel the weight of it all. Her past, her choices, the lives she had taken. But instead of feeling trapped by it, she felt free. Ayanna stood up and unsheathed the blade, staring at it in her hand. The steel glinted in the sunlight, its edge still sharp, but now it seemed like a reminder of everything she had been. A weapon forged in the heat of her anger, a tool for vengeance. But it didn't define her. With one swift motion, Ayanna threw the blade into the desert sands. It sank deep into the earth, disappearing from view. For the first time in years, Ayanna felt at peace. The anger that had fueled her was gone. She had claimed her vengeance, and now it was time to move on. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ayanna found a small, quiet oasis. The sound of water flowing softly over the rocks was the only sound in the stillness of the desert. She knelt beside the water, cupping her hands and drinking deeply. She could see her reflection in the water, the face of a woman who had been through so much, but had come out the other side stronger. There was a softness in her eyes now, a calmness that hadn't been there before. She wasn't just the fugitive anymore. She wasn't just the woman out for revenge. She was more than that. As Ayanna sat by the water, she felt a new sense of purpose. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she was no longer afraid. She had fought and survived. She had faced her demons and overcome them. And now, she could start anew. Ayanna didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in years, she felt ready to face it. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the oasis. Ayanna closed her eyes and breathed in the cool desert air, the weight of her past finally lifting. She had claimed her freedom, and now she would live it. Days passed, and Ayanna traveled deeper into the desert. She didn't know where she was going, but the land seemed to call to her, guiding her forward. She moved with purpose, her heart steady, her mind clear. The emptiness that had once consumed her was gone, replaced by something new, hope. For the first time in a long time, Ayanna allowed herself to smile. The world was open to her, full of possibilities. And for once, she didn't feel like she had to run anymore. The winds of the desert were fierce, but they carried her forward, toward a future she had never thought possible. And Ayanna walked on, free.